All right, good evening. Welcome to the program. You're listening to the Soapbox here on 90.9, 104.1 WMPG. My name is Eric Poulin. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. And you can join the conversation tonight either by calling us 780-4909 or by joining the conversation on Facebook. You can find us at facebook.com/thesoapboxportland. And tonight, I alluded to this last week, although we were off the air, so no one probably heard, but I wanted to do another show about Ferguson. We did one this summer, and I thought I'd invite Alex, our friend who works in law enforcement, back onto the program this evening to discuss the most recent sort of unsettling spate of news coming down in terms of accountability or lack of accountability for these crimes that have been committed, these murders that have happened. Michael Brown, Eric Garner, to name just a couple. Feel free to call up 780-4909. So as pretty much everyone has heard at this point, the grand jury in Ferguson, operating under prosecutor Robert McCulloch, chose not to indict Officer Darren Wilson for the murder of Michael Brown, an unarmed black teenager. Alex, can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can. Okay, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Eric. It's good to be back.
Okay, so I don't know if you could hear the show before.
I could.
Okay, I was just kind of trying to bring people up to speed, although I suspect everyone listening to the show knows what has happened. And let's just jump into it. What was your take on the lack of an indictment? Did you feel that that was a representation of equality of justice, or did you see something wrong with that?
Well, let me say first that from my understanding of Missouri law, that what happened, as far as we know from everything we can get from the grand jury testimony and what evidence we have, it probably was the right decision, or maybe involuntary manslaughter. Frankly, once the decision was made that you were going to have Officer Wilson testify, from everything I've heard from legal experts, it was right there. There won't be an indictment, or at best it's going to be involuntary manslaughter. And it tells you right there what the intention of the prosecution was. Mm-hmm. Because in a grand jury setting, the prosecutor can decide everything that's presented to them. The prosecutor can limit things, or the prosecutor can present more and more evidence. And essentially the sort of rule of thumb is the more evidence that's presented, the more people that testify, the stronger case you have not to indict. And that's why, for the most part, a prosecutor chooses to use the grand jury to get an indictment, mm-hmm. because that's their easiest way to get an indictment. And the fact that the prosecutor said, I'm going to make everything open and fair and everything's going to be out there, well, in many ways that would be good for grand juries in general. I think you'd have a lot fewer cases tying up the courts that ended up not in guilty verdicts, and we would have more trials based on really solid evidence. But in this case, I think it was his way of trying to not get an indictment without not making an attempt.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, I think that was fairly transparent, and a lot of people are really upset about that. I think a lot of people are sort of scratching their heads at why this couldn't have at least gone to a public trial. An indictment is not a guilty verdict. And I think a lot of people are upset. And then again, a lot of people are not scratching their heads and fully understand and appreciate how this happened, because there is not equality of justice under the law in this country, it would seem. But you mentioned something last time you were on the show, and I want to kind of revisit it and kind of go in a different direction. Last time you mentioned that, sort of the thing that officers say to themselves, to each other, is that if something goes down, you say that he went for your gun, right?
Yeah.
Do you remember saying that?
Oh, absolutely.
So I'm wondering if you can sort of shed some light on what is the chatter among officers that you've heard in reaction to the lack of an indictment, the protests, and the most recent sort of events that have erupted in Ferguson and around Ferguson and the country.
Well, I'll tell you that I wish I could say that more people feel that more of my colleagues feel that he should be indicted, but it's not the case. Most of my colleagues feel that the lack of an indictment was the right decision. They feel that Darren Wilson is being persecuted, that he's been unfairly portrayed in the media, and that the protesters should shut up and go home, that they lost. I think that right or wrong, and I'm not, making a judgment call on all the bad press that law enforcement in general has been getting lately. However, they feel that at this point, we as a law enforcement community are under attack by media which doesn't care about, criminals and basically hates cops except when they need them, and then they're never there in time, or typical frustrations, really. But
Alex,
in general,
that reminds
go ahead,
that's okay. That reminds me of I did a couple shows on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and in talking to each side of the conflict, they both felt that they were right. They both felt that they were under attack, and I suspect that the protesters, to hear you say that, or to hear law enforcement characterize themselves as under attack, would say, "You think you're under attack? Look at us. Look at our communities. Look at what we're subjected to repeatedly." And I think that both sides are sort of digging in their heels there, and that doesn't seem to serve anyone's purpose.
I completely agree with you. And in fact, I'd say that, and I think it's silly to all blame the media for problems. We know the media's motivation. The mainstream media is motivated on ratings and sales and advertising rates and so forth, and they're going to go with any story that's interesting. Mm-hmm. I think that the problem, the root of this problem in reaction to this, is that too many in law enforcement are saying things that seem to only inflame situations and showing a disrespect to the people of Ferguson, and beyond that, to minority communities as a whole, and to the argument, which has clear statistical background, that there is a bias in enforcement based on race and other socioeconomic factors. And at the same time, the characterization of all cops as, racist, murderous pigs, that's not going to make any kind of dialogue. There was a Facebook group that popped up and got something like 10,000 likes before it was shut down that said, "Execute Darren Wilson now." And I don't see how that does any good. I think that we learned some time ago that eye for an eye is not the best system of justice. And if we want to have some resolution, or perhaps a better way to say, we want to have, if we want to actually get our communities and law enforcement on the same page, where law enforcement is doing its job of serving its communities and being helpful, and members of communities are also helping, being witnesses to crimes rather than covering up crimes and so forth, and really working together, this dialogue has to step back. You can't expect two people who are both screaming at the top of their lungs to listen to each other.
You're listening to the Soapbox on 90.9, 104.1 WMPG, Southern Maine's community radio station from the University of Southern Maine. My guest this evening is Alex. He's been on the show before. You can find his previous episodes on the Soapbox's YouTube channel and in those episodes, we discuss why he is choosing to remain anonymous. But Alex is a law enforcement officer. We're discussing Ferguson right now. Alex, as you know, this country does not have a great track record with dealing with terribly complex problems, whether it's climate change or racism. And I think you're right in the sense that I know some police officers personally, you among them, and they're all decent people. These are decent people that are doing a very difficult job that we do ask of them, and they do this for us. But the problem is systemic. I think that it seems evident to a lot of people who are not in law enforcement that there is sort of a gross militarization that is happening that is creating an unnecessarily antagonistic relationship between law enforcement and the civilians that they're meant to protect. And there is a deep-seated racist element unbeknownst to a lot of the people in law enforcement, but it is there, and you alluded to it before, this implicit bias that exists.
I would go actually. I would disagree with you there, Eric. I think that there are very few people who work in law enforcement who are unaware of race and elements, be them covert or overt.
Mm-hmm.
I personally know plenty of racist cops.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Join the conversation, 780-4909. Alex, I really want to ask you this. When the evidence came out, we had these two competing stories, right? Officer Wilson says gave one account of how things went down, and the closest witness, Dorian Johnson, who was Mike Brown's friend, whom he was walking with at the time, gave a very similar account, but different in important ways. One of which was, Officer Wilson says that he was driving down the road and basically saw them walking in the middle of the street, pulled up to them and politely asked them to move to the sidewalk. Now, anyone who's ever been confronted by a police officer on the street, myself included, and I'm white, and this I had an encounter on the downtown streets of my own city. I was 100% sober, and it was a lovely evening, but there was an immediate aggression and antagonism directed at me, and an attempt at intimidation. And that is the account that Dorian Johnson offered, and that's the one that rings truer to me, and I think to most other people who've had any encounter with a police officer on the street. What was your take of the conflicting reports?
I'll say I don't see a ton of value in trying to parse who's telling the truth in those two cases. I mean, I will say probably it's closer to it's closer to say that it's more likely to be correct. That he was a lot more pushy and aggressive than just saying, "Excuse me, gentlemen, would you mind removing yourselves to the sidewalk?"
Mm-hmm. Well, fair enough. Let me ask you this then,
sure.
Because I think you will be able to offer unique insight to this part of the question. Officer Wilson had this ridiculous interview with George Stephanopoulos where and I say ridiculous because he made mid to high six figures for that interview alone. He got paid many hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that interview. Darren Wilson did, which I think is just a repugnant statement on our society and capitalism in general, and journalism. But anyway, that's beside the point. But the one thing that George Stephanopoulos did not ask him that I've wanted to get the answer to, and you raised this last time we talked about this, was why didn't he, rather than pull his gun, step on the gas? By his own account, the vehicle was still in gear for much of the encounter, and he claims when he was running through this mental checklist of his non-lethal options that he was left with no other option but to pull his gun and fire it. But he was in a vehicle which was on and in the road. Why couldn't he just pull ahead 20 feet, shake Michael Brown free from the vehicle, and reassess?
To me, there's no reason. I know that Missouri has legislation saying that police don't have to back down from an aggressor or whatever that might be, and that's maybe some issues that they have with the laws they have to do with granting police powers to use force. But to me, that's just beside the point. There is a systemic culture of macho culture in law enforcement. I do think that in some cases that's getting better and better, but it has a problem of officers feeling, no, I gotta deal with this. Or one of my buddies can say that, oh, you just ran away from that guy, he didn't even have a gun. The simple fact is the correct approach there is call for backup. That's in if not in orders, that is in policy of every department in the country. Call for backup.
And
Get
he did.
more numbers.
Officer Wilson.
It's simple training.
Yeah.
It's simple training for safety for everyone involved. I know for a fact that any officer is taught from, when they enter any law enforcement academy. If you get in a situation, don't go in until your numbers are more than theirs. For your own safety, if nothing else.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think Officer Wilson would say that the altercation began before he knew that he needed backup. But he had called for backup, and by his own admission, he had every reason to believe that they were mere seconds away when everything went down.
And yet he chose to continue the situation right there.
That's right.
He chose, and I think when we talked in the summer too, I chose to try to give whatever analysis I could of his use of force based on his account, in a sort of give the benefit of the doubt approach, if that's your best case scenario. Mm-hmm. Well, right there he says that Michael Brown is reaching across him to get his weapon out of his holster. Well, if he's doing that, one, if he's wearing a proper duty rig, as I understood that he had, that's a secure holster. It's actually, you can't just pull it straight out. So he can keep one hand on there fighting to keep the gun in the holster, and the other hand he could shift it to reverse, slam on the gas, throw Brown off his balance, shift it back into drive, zoom down the street, get himself in a secure position while he's awaiting for backup. There's all kinds of things he can do. The fact that he chose to get his weapon out and fire it while still in that vehicle, it makes absolutely no sense to me. It's and another thing I should say, in a stop, if he's stopping and talking to them right there and they're not reacting, well, he can also get out of his vehicle right there, which would give him a chance to instead perhaps pull out a taser if he thought they were going to be aggressive. There's all kinds of steps along the way before he has to go to deadly force.
He said, just so you know, he said that he doesn't carry a taser because it's uncomfortable.
Oh, that's true. I forgot. But regardless, there are all kinds of different methods that he could have used before going to that. And, as I said, to me, with all the different analyses by lawyers and activists and everyone of the different witness statements, there's actually a fantastic graphic I think that PBS put out. It's showing where witnesses agree and disagree on different questions and so forth. To me, trying to parse through all that and figure out, was it murder, was it not murder? At this point, everyone has made their decisions who's paying any attention at all. Mm-hmm. To me, the bigger thing is how can we do something about a culture in which most police officers choose to be aggressive immediately.
That is exactly the point that I was going to try to get to next. I mean, if you look at the example of Tamir Rice, who was killed in Cleveland, 12-year-old boy, there's a video out of the incident, and it's yet another example of seemingly poor training on the part of law enforcement, because this cop races up, and he's quite near to Tamir Rice when he gets out of the vehicle, and at that point, sure, if he thinks that Tamir Rice really does have a gun and he's pulling it on him, then, perhaps he's justified in firing. But why wouldn't he pull up his car further and position it in such a way that he can get the car between him and this person who he thinks might have a gun, so that there's a possibility of dialogue that can happen. There's a possibility of de-escalation that can happen before the officer puts himself in a position of being threatened. And
Yeah.
to a certain extent, Officer Wilson did the same thing. He put himself in a position where he could be in a threatened position.
Because he was being aggressive. That's exactly it. He chose to essentially escalate the situation. And with the case in Cleveland, I will say that from the video and from what I understand of the dispatch reports of the officers, I don't have a problem with the use of force in that situation. I've seen these. There really is no way they could have been able to tell that that was a fake gun just by looking at it from there. It's often the sort of thing where you actually have to look at it close or physically even hold it. But why pull up that close to it?
Right.
I can imagine excuses. Perhaps they didn't properly see him. They didn't see he was there, and they were pulling up to where they thought he was, and it's in this sort of gazebo thing, and maybe, by the time they noticed, oh, wait, that's him right there, they were already a couple feet from him, and they stopped. I can understand, an idea of, oh, he's right there. It looks like he's reaching for the gun. Apparently, they say they saw him, with the gun in his hand, I guess from the car, because they didn't have much time to see it after they got out of the car. I think it's about a second from when the door opens to when they open fire. It's a horrible situation. My problems with it have a lot more to do with the fact that toy guns are made, whatever, replica guns, whatever you want to call them, to look just like a real gun.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that should be legal. But that's a completely different argument.
Yeah.
But again, the aggressive approach of let's get in as close as possible. That certainly seems to look like what they were doing. They might have another explanation, which you could believe, but it comes down to this: that in a situation of even potential conflict, the majority, I would even go as far as say the vast majority of law enforcement officers choose to aggressively approach it. And the simple fact is, it ignores pretty basic psychology, though. When somebody is angry, you getting angrier at them tends not to make them less angry. But if you, say, surprise them by not being angry, by maybe taking a chance to listen to them in a situation, a lot of the times they calm down.
Mm-hmm.
You get to do something really cool and macho and punch someone and impress your buddies or something? No, but you also don't have to do a lot of annoying paperwork or potentially get yourself in the paper and called a murderer.
That's exactly the point I was going to move to next as well. I'm a special education teacher, and I work with a lot of students who have quite serious issues of aggression. And I'm trained in applied behavioral analysis, and it's very simple behavior science that you point out. If you meet aggression with anger or aggression, it is far more likely to escalate the situation than if you remain calm and neutral. More times than not, you will neutralize that aggression. So let me ask you, Alex, we're running out of time, but what sort of de-escalation training do police receive now? And if it's not sufficient, which it seems not to be, how do you see us moving forward? What sorts of reforms do you think could happen? And would law enforcement as a community, do you think, welcome those changes?
I would say rank and file would not welcome them. And that's mostly because you're talking about people who are ingrained in a culture and believe that, it would be, we'd probably refer to most methods as hug a thug. There certainly are, well, let me take a step back before I take too much time by going into detail. I will say that I think departments are moving more and more to getting better training. I know in my department, when I was in the academy, we had 2 weeks straight of just mental health training, recognizing mental illness and signs of mentally ill. But the crisis intervention training is optional and very rarely offered. I know that I never once saw an example, like even just like someone putting on a skit to show how do you deal with somebody who's acting really aggressive? How do you talk to this sort of a person? You know, these sort of things, this sort of kind of hands-on training to give an average officer an idea of how can I approach this situation differently. It's not really well taught. A lot more of the time you're taught, be on your guard, be ready to, for this person to attack, look for this, watch for signs of this sort of a thing. What do you do, training use of force? How are you looking at that? But as far as I know, there are very few departments that are focusing their training and use of force as how to avoid being in a use of force situation at all. The hope is if we can get some more pressure on law enforcement to make these sort of changes in a generation or so, we can see changes in that culture.
Do you see that? And this is we're running out of time. But final question is: do you see that change coming from forces from without of law enforcement or from within law enforcement? Do you think?
I think that it's going to have to be a combination for it to be really effective. I think that it's going to require, for departments to spend money on this, it's going to require serious outside pressure. Mm-hmm. But for that, this sort of training to be really effective, it's going to take examples and leadership from within. And that's, I am sorry to say, probably the hardest of these goals to accomplish.
Well, Alex, thank you very much once again for being here. And I sincerely wish, and I suspect most of my listeners would agree, that you weren't such an anomaly in law enforcement. But we're glad you're out there.
Thanks, sir.
And thank you very much for listening to the Soapbox here on 90.9, 104.1 WMPG. You can find us online at facebook.com/The Soapbox Portland. My name is Eric Poulin, and thank you to Michael for engineering this evening. Stick around here on WMPG. I will see you next week with Andy O'Brien, a journalist, to discuss the supposed pending demographic winter facing Maine with the exodus of young people and an aging population. But tune in next week for that. Have a good night.